What's going on, guys? Gabe here with ReviewDork, and we have the all-new 5950X, and we are upgrading the 3950X. Now, the 5950X is touted as AMD's answer to Intel, and this CPU is supposed to do it all for content creators, for gamers, most importantly, gamers. Now, the 3950X has a base clock of 3.5 gigs, as opposed to the 3950X, which has a base clock of 3.4 gigs. However, boost clock, the single core clock on this CPU, is 4.9, and we all know for gaming, single core clock speeds are everything. But before we get into that climatic comparison between the 3950X and the 5950X, we do have some benchmarks we're going to show you. But first and foremost, we have to change out the CPU. Now you guys can see here, my AIO is on the top. This is not front facing. I'm not sure if you guys can see that here with the overhead camera. There you go. As you guys can see, I have my AIO on top, and the reason being is because I allow gravity to assist the pump. Now you're going to see a lot of PC builds out there where the AIO is actually on the front panel, and that's a no-no. You might limit the life of your AIO. Now we got the CPU right here and here. We're going to go ahead and swap it out. We do have an X570 motherboard. Also, you guys might see this here, the RAM. Yeah, that is 128 gigs of RAM. This is not necessary or required for gaming. I mean, 32 gigs of RAM, more than fine. 16 gigs of RAM will get you there. We also have this monster of a GPU. This is an NVIDIA RTX 3090. When we do these benchmarks, guys, we're doing it at 1080 at medium settings, and the reason why we're doing that is because we want to tax the CPU. We are going to again benchmark at 1080p. We also have Cine 20 benchmarks, and we got Blender benchmarks, and you guys will see that in a second. But for now, make sure you guys like, share, subscribe. We're going to go ahead and swap out the CPU. So for my thermal paste, I am using an Arctic Silver polysynthetic thermal compound, right? And this is so that there can be adequate heat transfer so the CPU does not overheat. Now we do have the 3950X here, and we're actually going to recycle this CPU. Now we have to clean it up first before we put it away. And the way I like to do that is with the Q-tip and some rubbing alcohol. Looks good as new. We're actually going to take this CPU and we're going to throw it into our next build. We're actually going to make our next build to 32 gigs of RAM, and we're thinking about an RTX 3080 or an AMD 6900 XT.
24 hours later.
Okay, 24 hours later. So we ran into a hiccup. We had to update the BIOS because it was not recognizing the 5950X. We were getting a OD or 0D error. So we had to update the BIOS, and this would post. So we were treated to some incredible performance. Now, AMD touts these CPUs as the answer to Intel's dominance over gaming enthusiasts. My oh my, was I impressed. So when we did the benchmarks would include Blender, the BMW benchmark. We saw a significant savings. I mean, in the scheme of things, in the scheme of computational power, we saw a 3-second difference between the 3950X and the AMD 5950X, but when we overclocked it, we saw nearly a 7-second difference, and that was very, very impressive. And we're going to talk about overclocking in a second, but let's go to these race charts because we're able to see a couple of things, particularly with Cinebench Release 20. Now, the multi-core score, we had a dramatic increase in multi-core score, an increase of about 1,000. After overclocking, we had an increase of about 500 points. Now, this is a mild overclocking. We did not make any changes to the PBO or precision boost. Rather, we really didn't get into the BIOS to do overclocking, we use the Ryzen Master to overclock this. And again, it's a mild overclock. And for what we need this CPU to do to operate as a productivity workstation and also a gaming rig, it does both very well. Now, we want to warn you that when overclocking, you are going to see a drop in performance as far as frame rates with CPUs. And the way we benchmarked these games was at 1080p, and the reason why we did 1080p is because 4K will put more stress on the GPU, and we have a monster of a GPU, the 3090. And with that said, we kept it at 1080p medium settings. From the 3950X to the 5950X, we saw FPS increases of up to 25 frames per second, and that is pretty wild. Particularly with Forza, it just blew it away. And so, can this CPU handle Cyberpunk? Hell yeah. We went ahead and we did a benchmark with Cyberpunk. We saw a 25 frame increase with Cyberpunk as well. But what about productivity? Because that's why we got the CPU. Now, mind you, I did offer a disclaimer that I do have 128 gigs of RAM in my CPU. And when we have Adobe Premiere Pro, After Effects, Adobe Audition, and Photoshop running all at the same time, 128 gigs will get eaten up faster than Google Tabs will eat up your RAM. So from the 3950X, we took a 2-minute timeline with layers and adjustments and B-roll, and we exported in 1080. And a 2-minute video exported in 20 seconds. Now we upgraded to the 5950X, and that same export took 17 seconds. After a mild overclock, we got 15 seconds. And we were really impressed by these results because, again, one, it was a mild overclock. Two, it's only a $50 difference between a 3950X and a 5950X. If you are a creator, this chip makes all the sense. If you're a gamer, well, this is a solve-all, be-all Swiss Army knife CPU for anybody. And with Cyberpunk, let's just say there's bugs in the game. Obviously, there's bugs in the game, but this CPU was able to really push Cyberpunk, not only in 1080p, but in 4K. And we were really pushing Forza when we had an unlocked variable refresh rate, and we were pushing that upwards to 225 frames per second. Mind you, behind me is an LG CX monitor. It's 4K, it's 120 Hz. There's a lot to go over. Can the Ryzen 9 run Cyberpunk? Hell yeah. Oh my god, yeah. And it totally obliterates Gears 5, which is one of my favorite games, but I'm obviously rusty. I had like 2 kills. That's embarrassing to admit, but that's it, guys. The Ryzen 5 is pound for pound, dollar for dollar, the productivity gaming CPU of the year, and we're still waiting for Intel to respond. Anyways, this is Gabe. I'm signing out. Peace.